What do Horatio Gates, Revolutionary War General John Adams, Josiah Quincy, Charles Francis Adams, and United States Navy Rear Admiral William T. Sampson and Joseph Smith all have in common? They were all kinsmen from interrelated families and united in their anti-slavery, pro-union, religious and military activity. Yes, what if I told you that Joseph Smith was not only a Mormon leader, he was working on behalf of the federal government in its organized campaign after the War of 1812 to spread Western settlers into the Western territories to displace the Indians or convert them to Christianity, because they had been having so much trouble with the British and the Native Americans joining forces, such as in the 1812 war, that this was the federal government's solution, and they needed the Mormon leader, Joseph Smith, and his prominent, well-connected Mack and Smith families, all involved in this operation to spread to the western states in what we know as manifest destiny. So why were the Mormons called Mormons? Well, same reason why Moore's Indian Charity School was called Moors. At the time, the scholars believed that the Native Americans all came from North Africa and were part of what they call the interracial Semitic and black Moors. So what did Joseph Smith and all these eminent politicians and military men have in common? They were all kinsmen from interrelated families and united in their anti-slavery, pro-union, religious and military activity, versus Brigham Young, who was pro-slavery, anti-union, and was a secret asset for the British Crown. And that divides these early Nauvoo Mormons. Some were British infiltrators fighting on the side of Britain and pro-slavery, and others were trying to fight against slavery and were pro-union. Well, those seem to be mighty big, irreconcilable differences between brothers in one religion. So what's a good brother supposed to do? Well, according to Brigham Young, you act like a mobster. And you get rid of your rival. Nauvoo after Joseph Smith's assassination. So common a practice had horse stealing become that the river crossing between Nauvoo and Montrose was widely known as the Thieves' Ferry. It had even more sinister reputation. Tales were told of how Danites, mounted on fleet horses, would seize men against whom death had been decreed by their organization, strap them behind them, be ferried to the center of the stream, there cut out the entrails of their victims, and sink their bodies to the water. People on both sides of the Mississippi lived in constant dread, hardly daring to unbar their doors after nightfall. In May 1845, a German family in Lee County, Iowa, was murdered in the manner exceptionally brutal. The murderers were the Hodge brothers. They were tracked back to Nauvoo by Edwin Bonney and discovered to be living in the remote part of the town of Nauvoo. It is said that one of the Hodge brothers pleaded with Brigham Young to save his two younger brothers, but notwithstanding, the brothers were hanged. What's interesting about this is that John D. Lee, in an independent corroborating story in his autobiography, states that he witnessed the Hodge brothers being arrested and tried for murder, and that Brigham Young admitted to him that he had set up the Hodge brothers and he had the older brother murdered by the Danites. One of the most celebrated cases of murder attributed to the Mormons was that of Colonel George Davenport. Colonel Davenport was by birth an Englishman, but coming to America to serve this country as a soldier of war in the 1812 war. He had seen many adventures both by land and by water, and in Indian times had been a highly esteemed friend of the old Chief Black Hawk. He now, in 1845, was living in substantial elegance on the island of Rock in the middle of the Mississippi River. One day he was in his parlor reading, and he heard a sound. Here he was confronted by three men. One of the three discharged a pistol at him. He was then seized, thrown down, and dragged up the stairs by his beard. They blindfolded him and put him on his bed, demanded more money. He took them to the safe. They unlocked the safe, it says. I'm just going to paraphrase. Unlocked the safe. They became very agitated and beat man to unconsciousness. However, he died eventually, but not before he was able to describe his assailants, which he described as Mormons. This was the last straw for the federal government and for the people around Illinois and Iowa. At this point, there was a conference held, and Illinois and the federal government, the assistance of Stephen A. Douglas, who had been Joseph Smith's good friend, Stephen A. Douglas crafted the agreement where the Brigham Young band of pirates and thieves would be escorted out of the state in exchange for not prosecuting Brigham Young for murder. I mean, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young are night and day. And I'm going to show you, if everybody gets bogged down in polygamy, and I'm going to give you my opinion about the polygamy issue. It's really a red herring. It's not a red herring for those that are enslaved here in Utah. But as far as determining which Joseph Smith you want to believe, well, I believe there is some real confusion, and Joseph Smith is partially responsible. I personally do not see any evidence that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy himself, but he did cause the confusion in that he was allowing by the Mormon Church to marry previously married immigrants into Nauvoo who had left or abandoned their spouses in another state. He did this to accommodate the growing population of Nauvoo, which he needed in effort to promote anti-slavery and the anti-voting and the anti-slavery voting bloc. He needed as many people as he could. So accommodating people in their marriage, even though they weren't legally divorced in other states, seemed like a practical solution to him. The state had withdrawn any Mormon ability to license marriages because I guess Sidney Rigdon had been arrested in Ohio for trying to marry two people who had not properly divorced. So the state was trying to stop all this abandoning of women and children in various states, while some of the drifters just drifted out of town and left abandoned children unsupported. So you can see both sides. Joseph Smith was attempting to accommodate the growing population, and probably it was not a wise decision to allow the Mormon marriages of people who had not properly divorced. I also believe that Hiram Smith, there was something going on at the end dealing with Hiram Smith. He had previously married Mary Fielding, who was known or believed to be one of these Cochranite plural wives. And I believe she planted the seed in Hiram Smith's ear. And there may have been something dealing with Hiram Smith, because the whole chaos at the end requiring the Relief Society issue a public warning against polygamy, and Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith issuing a public denouncement of polygamy, leads me to believe there was something to some of the rumors, at least dealing with Hiram Smith. In any event, Joseph Smith's marriage policy never envisioned, like John C. Bennett and Wilson Law, seducing 16 and 15-year-old orphan girls and telling them that Joseph Smith authorized it. Joseph Smith never envisioned that kind of twisting of his words, and when he found out about the young women being seduced, and some of them perhaps contracting syphilis through the Higbee boys, he immediately excommunicated salacious older men seducing young unmarried girls. That was never the policy. That was never Joseph Smith's marriage policy. And let's put on our critical thinking hats. How does any of the polyandry, the wife swapping going on in Nauvoo have any resemblance to the Utah polygamy, in which none of the women could swap partners? Or so they say today. I do believe they were still swapping partners in Utah. And John D. Lee and many of the apostles did swap wives. They did a little ceremony, but it's still free love, wife swapping kind of organization, even in Utah. I mean, what was going on in Nauvoo has nothing in common, which was finally publicized in Utah as their Mormon polygamy. But then again, Joseph Smith must take some of the responsibility for the chaos. His overreaching policy of allowing marriages when the people were not legally divorced in other states. But let's get back to Joseph Smith Jr.'s family, political, and religious affiliations. I've done a previous video where I showed that Joseph Smith was 100% Jewish, Sephardic Jew. And that comes from the fact of the unique way that the Jews do their genealogy. What they do is they go through the matriarchal line. So if you are an offspring of a mother who has 200% Jewish parents, you are considered 100% Jew, even if your father is a Gentile. Now let me be very clear here. Contrary to what the current biases try and tell you, to be a Jew is not an ethnic classification. There were Jewish Egyptians, there are Jewish Iranians, there are Jewish Persians, there's Jewish. To be Jewish is not an ethnic group. It is a religious organization. Therefore, when I say that Joseph Smith is 100% Jewish, it means he was born under the covenant of Abraham, according to Jewish tradition, religious tradition. It has nothing to do with his ethnicity. I learned this in a very embarrassing way when I asked a girl in high school about her ethnicity, and she looked at me, she said, "I'm Jewish. It's a religion. It's not a race." That's how embarrassing it can become. So Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack, her father was Solomon Mack, but his mother was also Jewish, Lydia Gates. I traced her line. So coming from two Jewish parents, Lucy Mack would be 100% Jewish. Even though she married Joseph Smith Sr., her offspring, such as Joseph, who immigrated 100 years earlier from Essex, England, just like Horatio Gates, and landed with the Virginia Company and established Middlesex County. Another relative, an offspring of Mr. Gates, married into the Olmsted family. They founded Hartford, Connecticut, and were well-established, very prominent founding members of the whole Connecticut. And as you recall, Lucy Mack Smith was from Lyme, Connecticut. That's all the time I want to spend on that. What I want to spend on is the eminent bloodlines both the Smiths, but especially Lucy Mack, comes from. Lucy Mack's mother was Lydia Gates, a very prominent New England from Connecticut family line. I showed you earlier, Horatio Gates. He is a British cousin to Lucy Mack's great-grandfather who immigrated 100 years earlier from Essex, England, just like Horatio Gates, and landed with the Virginia Company, established Middlesex County. Now, Lucy Mack's great-great-grandfather, who came from Essex County and established Connecticut, and Horatio Gates, who came over just during the Revolutionary War, but was also from Essex, would be considered kinsmen or cousins because ties were kept between British and American heirs of similar families. Horatio Gates became good friends with John Adams and is reputed to have released all of his slaves, which shows you that families are simpatico. And it's my belief that Horatio, who had plotted somewhat of a little coup against Washington, was probably more pro-United States than Washington, who, established the central bank. A complete political lie, okay? He established the central banking cartel stranglehold over the United States until Andrew Jackson terminated the British central banking cartel by getting rid of the United States Bank. So in case you've forgotten, let's review my initial question. What do Horatio Gates, Revolutionary War General John Adams, Josiah Quincy, Charles Francis Adams, and United States Navy Rear Admiral William T. Sampson and Joseph Smith all have in common? Well, funny you should ask, because I was quite surprised when I discovered from Josiah Quincy that the Hill Cumorah was owned by Admiral Samuel T. Sampson's family. So that got me wondering. I thought, what a strange connection. Why would Joseph Smith choose to place the last battle of the Nephites and Lamanites on a hill owned by a U.S. admiral? Oh, and by the way, I've heard many scholars discuss where the word Hill Cumorah comes from. Cumorah comes from the word Qumran, where the last battle of the Jews in Megiddo occurred in Israel. The last battle between the Romans and the Jews, which the Romans exterminated, the last holdout of Jewish rubble. So what are the other connections? First, Hiram and Stephen Mack were trained at an eminent prep school at Dartmouth called the Moore Indian Charity School, in which it was dedicated, this particular school was dedicated to educate young Native or interracial men to go out and proselytize into Christianity Native Americans. Number two, although the church was formed in New York, it quickly immigrated over into the Ohio Valley, hotbed where the Native Americans joined with the British, started War of 1812. This was a particular problem area for the United States because the Hessian offspring also resided in the Ohio Valley, previously British territory. And the Hessians were German soldiers. They were mercenaries that were paid by Britain to fight on the side of Britain during the Revolutionary War. Some of these soldiers did not return home, settled in the British part of the Ohio Valley. So this had become a particular problem. So they needed to send over some emissaries or religious leaders for a gathering of saints to at least secure this area, convert formerly rebellious Native Americans, and hopefully get rid of all the British infiltrators that were residing in this area. Number three, it perked my interest that in Lucy Mack's autobiography, she states that she and the saints traveled, formerly owned by her uncle, General Mack, and the ship's captain informed her that he had purchased the book from her eminent uncle. And who was her eminent uncle, General Mack? Well, he was Stephen Mack Sr., founder of Detroit, Pontiac, Michigan, and also the owner of the Bank of Michigan, and very wealthy. He also owned 2 ships to run his mercantile business and were used in the War of 1812. Of course, it was not a coincidence that Lucy Mack's Mormon saints were being transported on her Uncle Mack, General Mack's ship, and the ship's captain came and greeted her personally because she was very important. She was a very important guest, and he was transporting some very important saints. Have you ever wondered where all the money came to start the Mormon Church? They arrive in Kirtland, Illinois, and quickly build up a city, and they finance the Mormon temple, the Kirtland Temple, which Lucy Smith says she personally raised all the money. And of course she did. She did it through her very eminent, wealthy family. And you can study Mormon history to see how many Macks ended up in Nauvoo. It was a family-run religion, the Smith family and the Macks. And the Brigham Young imposters were simply British disruption agents. They were espionage ruffians. And finally, but not least, it is not coincidental that the eminent Josiah Quincy and Charles Adams show up in Nauvoo late one night, 45 days before the assassination of Joseph Smith. They were there on a special emissary mission. What secret plans they discuss, I have my theories. But Josiah Quincy has left us a very nice essay detailing some of the remarkable qualities of Joseph Smith, and also stating that he, Joseph Smith, being anti-slavery, had one of the most brilliant solutions to solving the slavery problem, which was to sell federal land and compensate all the present slaveholders for releasing their slaves, and this was done successfully in England. I'm not going to dwell that long on all the nuggets of secret information that is found in Josiah Quincy's essay on Joseph Smith, but I just want to leave you with this particular interesting vignette that I think will solidify my theory that Joseph Smith was acting on behalf of the federal government in order either to convert the Native Americans to Christianity and make them peaceful citizens, or remove them further west, as it was the intention of the United States government to continue its westward push in its manifest destiny to rid the western territories of the hostile British, Mormon, and Texas slaveholders. Of Keokuk's-Wit, a striking instance has been preserved. It seems, so the story runs, that on one occasion, after the removal of the Sioux west of the Mississippi, they were summoned to a conference with the Mormons at Nauvoo, Illinois, by Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. The object of this wily prophet in seeking a conference was to persuade the Indians into relinquishing to him certain lands which he coveted for the church. He accordingly prepared with great care the plea which he should make to them. At the appointed time, Keokuk and the prophet, each in their best attire, attended by imposing retinues, met in the Mormon temple. In concluding his address, the prophet said that he had been divinely communicated to him from on high that the Indian tribes of North America were the lost tribes of the house of Israel. Moreover, he had been commissioned from on high to assemble such of them as were near him, and to remove them from where they were to a new land, a land flowing with milk and honey. To this Keokuk listened very attentively, and after a respectful interval he rose with much dignity to reply. As to whether or not the American Indians were these lost tribes spoken of by the prophet, he said, he would not attempt to determine. This, however, he would say. Of milk his people were not fond of. They preferred water. As for honey, it was to be had in ample quantities on the land they occupied. Could not the prophet enter more fully into the particulars? Did the government in which this land to which he desired the Indians to go and move pay large, say, annuities? And was there plentiful supply of whiskey? The conference, it need hardly be said, came to an abrupt termination. Keokuk was remembered as one of the most eloquent speakers of his day. And in fact, at this special meeting between the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith and Keokuk, Keokuk appeared to have a more eloquent speech. I think this little vignette demonstrates substantially that Joseph Smith was not just a religious leader, but he was an agent for the federal government purchasing Native American lands for westward expansion. And of note, Joseph Smith did succeed in purchasing half the property that now is located in Keokuk, the township. My ancestor, a Mormon, is buried in Keokuk, and he died in 1848 in Keokuk. That has been one of my family mysteries. Why did my grandfather show up dead in Keokuk? And I have several theories, but now this has answered one of my theories, that the Mormon settlement was designed to be a Mormon settlement in Keokuk. My great-grandfather was a road engineer, had cut most of the roads through South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and that is why he shows up in Nauvoo with his extended family. It was 2 brothers and 1 patriarch and their wives. It was to cut roads through Illinois. And of course, when you end up in a community, you join the church. Well, they joined the Mormon church and continued their business. When I arrived in Keokuk, I did some research on it, and I'm going to give you another riddle. What does Quincy, Illinois, Keokuk have in common with Nauvoo? These are ports on the Underground Railroad in which steamships run by black deckhands would secrete escaped slaves in their holds, and each of these ports represented a safe haven for the steamship carrying up escaped slaves into Ohio, where lawyers were waiting to file lawsuits for their freedom. You see, during the fugitive slave laws, both black and white bounty hunters were kidnapping black free people and selling them into bondage. And so many of the supposed black slaves held in the South were actually kidnapped free people. And this is why it was so important that they escape and be given lawyers in the free state of Ohio. So you have black bounty hunters, you have white bounty hunters, and they were kidnapping free black people from the North or from the South and selling them into slavery. Well, this is what the Underground Railroad was designed to do. It was to hide some of these free black slaves in their cargo holds, take them up to the Ohio Valley where attorneys were waiting to file their cases for freedom. And my particular relative, known as John Joliffe, was one of these attorneys in Ohio. He personally had his office burned by mobsters. He later moved to Washington, D.C. This is John Joliffe, where, again, at the end of his life, his entire office and all his records were burned, and he died a broken man. This is the cruelty of this age. Let us not forget our ancestors and what they had to endure to get us to this point in history. And so I am left with a burning question after finishing this video. Did the Mormons, the Joseph Smith, Lucy Mack Mormons, do more to establish the Underground Railroad ports than any of the purported people you find in Wikipedia? And if so, their legacy, this very important legacy to the United States history, has been completely erased. And I believe that is criminal. And I also believe it needs to be corrected. So I leave you with this. Have peace, and hopefully we'll maintain our freedom.